My name is Jill Randolph. I'm a first-year MBA student at MIT Sloan, and it is my pleasure to introduce the presentation on using wearable technology to refine the return-to-play process in the NBA. With us, we have Dr. David Martin, Director of Performance Research and Development at the Philadelphia 76ers. Pass it.
Okay. Thank you very much for attending this session. I'd like to start by just recognizing some co-authors and collaborators on this project. There's a group at the Philadelphia 76ers that work in their medical team. They're listed over here on the left with our physiotherapist, a sports scientist, medical doctor, and another medical doctor who's advising. We also have some collaborators that work with this company, I Measure You. Tor's done some really interesting work on using accelerometers to understand limb loads. Philip, who works with this company, Connexon, that is involved with player tracking, and David, who's a professor that works in physical therapy as well. The idea here is not really to tell you as much about product, but more process. I do need to tell you that the Philadelphia 76ers are involved with two, just as a disclosure, we're involved with the two companies, Connexon and I Measure You. The NBA Wearables Committee, which has recently been formed, they have approved the use of Connexon with NBA players. I Measure You is currently in the process of becoming approved. I do need to also let you know that neither myself nor any of my collaborators or colleagues are getting any money or are directly employed by the companies that I'm talking to you about. So let's talk a little bit about this return to play process. Imagine, if you will, just for a minute, a pretty high profile player. They're going to come to a team that you're working with, and unfortunately they get injured very early on. This is a high profile player. With that injury, it looks like you're going to need surgery. And so you go find a great surgeon, and you feel very confident the surgery is good. And after that, you need a physical therapist or a physiotherapist that's going to really commit and try to help this player get back onto the court. They do their job. They're very well read. They have learned colleagues. And that athlete now has tissue that looks like it's healed. The bone is better. The tendon is better. You get to a point where they're starting to play on the court, and it's starting to look good. He's frisky. He's ready to go. He can't wait to start playing. Agents are a little bit concerned because if he comes back too early, he's at risk of re-injuring himself again. If he goes too late, the front office is going to get a little bit upset, as do the coaches, because if he's super good, you might be dropping some games. So this is the space we're in. We're in the place of you can practice, but you can't play. And how do you make that decision? Everybody on this slide is interested in when they're going to get back on the court. So what we're going to talk about here today is just a little bit about wearable tech, a little bit about sports injuries in the NBA, and then understanding the demands of competition is really the overlap right here where I believe that the wearable technology may have a real role to play. Wearable technology, as you guys know, basically defines any instrumentation that can be applied to the body. There are a whole host of different application sites now and a whole number of different things that technology can allow doctors and physiotherapists and coaches to actually measure. The technology tends to be broken into two main categories: that kind of technology that allows you to understand what is the athlete doing, but then also the kind of technology that allows you to understand how the human body is responding to what the athlete is doing. And some people will argue that it's really important to measure heart rate, which is a response variable. Others will say it's really important to measure what they're doing, like some kind of tracking device. But it's probably the case that it's both variables together. And there's another couple of really good meta-review papers that have come out talking about when the two variables uncouple, both the input and the output responses. When you look at, say, how are you moving and how is your heart rate, they're coupled here. But then when they uncouple, that becomes a really interesting perspective. So when you get into the wearable tech space, there's a lot of questions that you're going to be asking yourself. First and foremost, you're going to want to know, is it accurate? Like, are you going to be able to get reliable data? And this market is not regulated. So as long as you get a signal coming out of a device, you can sell it. And for those of us that are working in the space of return to play, you got to be very careful that you're working with technology that you trust. If the data sets are bouncing around, you can get yourself into a whole bunch of problems where you think somebody's doing well when in fact they're not. You just have an artifact or a filtering problem or something else that's going wrong with the data. So you have to be very choosy. The technology is going into a whole bunch of different places, but one thing I will point out here, such as like say an instrumented contact lens or an ingestible pill or some of the sweat patches or instrumented mouth guards or even wearable devices that let you look at brain waves, you have to think about how you're going to apply this to a very high profile player. And I'll make the point right now that if you apply the technology in a way that seems like you're policing the athlete, you could very easily get kickback. If you're applying the technology in a way that you're providing new insight to a process, then the athletes are usually right on board and they want to see the data. With that in mind, let's turn to injuries in the NBA. It just so happens that there are a lot of injuries in this particular sport, in this particular league. About 1 in 4 athletes will sustain an ankle injury that will keep them out of at least one game. And so we know there's a number of injuries, a lot in the lower limb, the knee and the ankle in particular. And we know that these injuries occur at a fairly frequent rate throughout the entire season. And for those of you that are interested in tracking injury rates, there's all kinds of, ESPN has their website, Man Games Lost, In-Street Close, Pro Transactions. There's a whole number of databases out there. Most of them are contaminated. They're not super accurate, but they're accurate enough to get the trends. They're contaminated because if a person's not playing, the people that are monitoring the injury think they're not playing because of the injury. But some athletes come back and they have healed, but they're just not deemed suitable to play from a strategical position. So that's not actually an injury keeping them out of play. Nevertheless, there's a lot of injuries in the NBA. A lot of them occur in the lower body. When the injury occurs, there's a pathway that the athlete will go through, and there's this initial medical treatment pathway. And to do this area really, really well, you better understand how to diagnose the problem. Some of the biggest problems in the NBA have occurred because it has been a misdiagnosed problem. For whatever reason, the problem has not been accurately diagnosed. If you don't have an accurate diagnosis, then no wearable technology is going to save you. You've started to go down a path that you're going to become very, very frustrated with. As you get into the rehabilitation space, you need to really understand the effects of load and how exercise can influence tissue and tissue remodeling. And if you understand some of the fundamental research that allows you to see how tendons and ligaments and bone respond to load, then you can start to move through criterion-based progressions that hopefully will get you to the end point without incurring tons of risk, but also without wasting a lot of time. Once you get to the point where the player is practicing, but they're not playing, you need to understand the demands of competition. If you don't understand the game, exactly what the player is going to be required to do, then you might have some mismatches when they're playing, practicing a lot. And you think that they're ready because they've been practicing full court, they've been scrimmaging, but the style of practice is very different to the style of the game. And so you've actually gone through a really unaccustomed exposure to some high-intensity exercise the athlete may not be ready with. Some of the research that's been done right now to look at how tissue responds to load is quite interesting, and it opens up a really fun place for the wearable technology to move into. If you grow up ligaments, and this is being done in some laboratories, you can stress that ligament a number of different ways. And you can look at optimal dosing patterns. If you put too much stress on that ligament, then it can be in like a catabolic process, or it can be in a stagnated state where you don't really get on top of the load. You just try to tolerate the load. If you don't have enough of a stimulus, then you don't have collagen resynthesis. And so there's a sweet spot that you can start to see in a lot of different tissues, like ligaments, and a lot of bone studies that have been done on rodents to look at optimal loading cycles to allow for bone mineral formation rates to be enhanced. There's some really fun studies that have looked at humans intact to look at what kind of doses work and what kind of doses don't work. When the technology complements your understanding of the tissue, you start to have some really nice feedback models for starting to tune how the load is going to balance with the response to that load. This study right here by Burr is a classic example. This is basically a model where they're looking at rodent bone, they're bending it, and it's a strain response curve where you can take a look at a given amount of force applied at different frequencies of stimulus, or a given response where you have the same frequency, but you move with different loads. You can see there's very nice linear relationships. With this, you can characterize the bone formation rate with some very simple equations, and this has allowed some of the researchers in the wearable tech space to move into a concept of mechanobiological approaches, where they start to build up a response variable that is a surrogate for daily load stimulus coming just from the accelerometers that are placed down on the tibia to give an indication of the kind of stresses that might be happening with the bone. If you take a sensor and you understand some of these relationships, then you can put the sensor right down on the end of the tibia, and you can start to then come up with some proxies for what you think is going on with bone load. Now, these are not super precise, but they can help you understand low, moderate, and severe loading patterns. And once you do that, you can come up with a daily cumulative load, and you can also start to look how your loading programs are starting to match with the fundamental research that's coming out of the laboratories that tell you when bone is probably going to respond to load and when bone is not going to respond to load. This doesn't mean that you don't have clinical acumen around you. You need to see, is the joint getting swollen? Is it stiff? Is it painful? That's going to help tune the model. But at least you have some input instead of just working a guy out and just kind of hoping for the best and let time do its thing. It gives you a little bit more direction on the process. I said I wasn't going to use that word. This is a diagram right here, and it would show basically now the ability to look at like a cumulative bone load in an individual who sustained a lower limb injury. It might be a bony injury, and you can start to put together some thoughtful patterns of overload, and you can see that this line here would be your surrogate bone load marker. You can see that the training has been put together with a rhythm through the week so that you have a nice gradual progression in the bone load. In this particular case, you can see there might be an event where they go and they get radiological scanning, and so you start to see an image of the bone to see what the status looks like, and it may not be responding like you want it to. And if that's the case, then you have something to go back to. You can reduce the load, not completely, but you can reduce the load to loading states that you had experienced previously in the loading cycle. It allows you to start to go back to some numbers if you have different practitioners that are working with the injured athlete. You might have a physical therapist that's turned things over to a strength conditioning coach, but all of the load is going to come through foot strikes. And so you can go back to a place where you are grounded in some of the loading patterns that you might want to induce. The other thing you can do is sometimes the modalities that are finding their way into rehabilitation are varied. They can run in the water, they can run in altered G, these low gravity scenarios, and it's sometimes hard to know what the different speed unloading parameters do at the end of the day to the ground contact forces that are coming up through the lower limb. So you can put some of these sensors on the leg, waterproof them, and you can look here. These graphs are looking at like the right leg and the left leg at very low Gs of deceleration, acceleration to moderate Gs of acceleration, deceleration. And you can start to compare what's happening in early rehab to where you want to go if you have scrimmage data, which is showing you how many footsteps are happening in the right foot and the left foot out here at very high, maybe 7.5, 8 times body weight type loading versus less than 1 time body weight type loading. And so you can see symmetry between the limbs, and you can start to build up the progressions of let's do the low intensity stuff first and then move to the moderate and then move up to the high and the very high. So it gives you some reference points for your progressions. So let's say now that we're in this situation where we've got really nice tissue healing. We've been monitoring the athlete. We've been right down at the foot. We've been looking at how the forces are probably going through the foot. We're looking at the exposure daily, exposure weekly, and the athlete has gone through a nice 6 to 8 week progression. There's no pain, there's no swelling, there's no stiffness. They're back on the court, and now they're starting to play. The next question is, when do they actually play a game? So we're going to talk right here. They're kind of in full practice. It's looking pretty good. but we don't know whether they should return to play. To do this, what we need to do is understand the game. So I'm going to real quickly talk to you about some of the features of a game that would be worthwhile for the practitioner to know about before they can identify if the athlete is really ready to play with an acceptable level of risk. So for understanding movement patterns, there's a number of different types of companies right now that are moving into player tracking. But once you have some type of, say, RFID player tracking device like Connexon, then what you can do is you can start to get some pretty detailed understandings of how the athlete is moving around on the court. In games, we've got tons of game data. We're seeing it in so many sessions here at the MIT Sloan Conference. So you have game data. So if you have practice data, you can start looking at matching. Just grab this here. When I first got excited about how many miles a basketball player ran, and I started looking at where the technology was going, I remember a professor that I had when I was in graduate school. He said, always go back to the fundamental basic literature. Don't just Google it. Go as deep as you can and try to find out who's been there before you. Just so happens, this is a great little paper, 1931. Messersmith and his colleagues at DePauw, they create a little device and they track. It's a brass wheel with electric current and a tin plate. They can connect the circuit and they can count with a projected image onto this little apparatus how far a guard runs in a basketball game. And they would ask people, how far do you think they run? People say, I don't know, 5 miles, 6 miles, 10 miles. It so happens it's about 2 miles, 2.5 miles. And they could look not only at how far they ran, but how fast they were running as they accumulated that distance. So if you look at some of their data, you can see here, they've done this back in the 1930s, guys, really nice work. You can see that, most of the time is spent with these little bursts. They run for 2 minutes, they're about 3 to 4 miles per hour. But you can see they have times that are slower and they have times that are faster. This is starting to demonstrate for us some of the real basic fundamentals of what you're trying to train for. I took a little look at this and I compared it to last year's data from some of the highest minute guys in the NBA. Just so happens that, if you're a guy like Harden, you might be out there averaging around 36 minutes per game for the 2016-17 season. All these data are, publicly available. And you can see this is where the 1930s paper identified a player from DePauw, about 40 minutes. And the interesting thing is they're covering about the same distance. And the other thing that's kind of interesting is they're actually running around on average at about the same speeds. Once you know the actual global picture, you can start to boil in a little bit. So we were really lucky. Ivana, who works within our group, she's with the data analytics group. She's like, look, all these data are available to all of you. If you want to know how fast they're running up and down the court, we can pull all those data out. You can get over, 1.2, 1.5 million data points from these guys running up and down the court. And you can find out that when they run up and down the court, they're running at about 6 to 10 miles per hour. Sometimes they're running up around 13, 14, all the way up to 17 miles per hour, and sometimes they're really barely moving. So if you're trying to get ready to get on the court, you better be ready not only for the number of transitions in these speeds, but also be ready for the very high speeds coming your way. The other thing you can do is you can break these data down and you can say, when you start running, how long do the running bursts last? Well, last year with the timeouts the way they were, you could see that people were running from about 90 to 120 seconds. This is just our team. All these data are available for all the teams. And you can see that a lot of times the amount of effort in the NBA is less than 30 seconds. It tends to be about 90 seconds to 2 minutes, but sometimes you got to get ready to play solid for 3 minutes. There's no break for 3 to 4 minutes. You can also see what kind of recovery periods. These bumps here are from the timeouts. You can also look at how many times when you run a length of the court and play, how many times in sequence is that going to happen? This is all setting the standards for the demands of competition that the injured athlete is going to have to be ready to deal with. This is some nice work Sergi did. Again, all of these data are publicly available. He just data visualized it for us. It's a really nice look at each period, and you can see that the length of the little bar is how long you played before you got a break. The color of the bar is how intense the density of intensity of how quickly you're running up and down the court. And you can see that if you're rehabbing an athlete, you've got to get them ready for some very intermittent activity that spans for about a 2-hour game, if not longer. You can take another look. This comes straight out of the Connexon software. You can see how the full court transitions sequence together. And you can see some of the most demanding patterns of games. These are different styles of games that we looked at for one individual. And we can start to see when in the fourth quarter, when in the first quarter, what happens before halftime and after halftime might happen to their bodies. And we can use this information to build little simulated exercise sessions that we think give us insight to whether they're ready to play or not. Another thing that you can get from the games is you can have a situation where you can start building up symmetry patterns. These symmetry patterns which come from right foot, left foot, you can get these out of practices. These are data from the New Zealand Breakers, a professional team down in New Zealand. And they were able to monitor right leg and left leg and some athletes through a full season and all of their practices. You can see these little banding patterns that at this intensity of foot strike, you can see that you'd be in a situation where the right leg is dominating the number of foot strikes. But as you move up to the real high intensity, the left foot is getting more. And it's not necessarily the pattern, but changes in pattern that might be alarming for you. And you would hope the injured athlete can come back to something that seems normal. The other thing you can do with some of these player tracking and some of this great artificial intelligence work that's going on is you can start to look at features. You know, how many times did you catch the ball, pass the ball? How many times did you shoot the ball off the dribble? When you have time, contested, uncontested, defensive slide, steal, all the contact that's going on in the post position. To add this up, it kind of sets the end point for where the rehab is going to go. And if you can match the physical features, then what you get is a really nice confidence boost for the athlete. But you also get a communication piece for the owners and the general managers and the coaches so that you feel confident that the person is really ready to play. So we get these kind of different profiles that we will use in the rehabilitation process to tell them we want to make sure that you're ready for segments that last 3 to 6 minutes long. We need to make sure you're doing transitions every 10 to 20 seconds in some of our drills. We want to make sure you're ready for continuous play that lasts up to 3 minutes. We want to make sure that you can get 6 to 8 full court transitions, with some of them being very intense. And these are the patterns that are position specific that you can show each of the athletes as they go through the rehab process. And I find like when they see that, they welcome the wearable technology. They say, I know exactly what you're doing. You're helping me build the bridge from where I'm at to where I want to go. The take-home message, not the take-home message, which is the next slide for the conference organizer, we're right on time, just right on time, it's going flawless, there's nothing like the anxiety of running a session and just the clock is dead, which it is, but we're not quite done, but almost. Is when you use technology, there is a psychosocial element to technology, especially with the injured athlete, that we all need to be aware of. And if you're working with a pretty high profile player, and this guy is like, his whole career is on the line, and you're gonna come to him, and you're gonna put a piece of technology onto him, you're going to have to convince them this is for the greater good. If it's for a sell or a trade, or if it's for a private conversation that he'll never hear about in a front office or in a back room, they're going to be highly, highly suspicious, and they should be. But if they believe that that technology is something that's going to help them build this bridge we've just talked about, they'll actually get really quite excited. And technology has impact on whether you're going to go from the really negative side of human emotions to all the really, really positive sides. So let me finish by just saying the guys that are investing their money, the guys that are coaching these teams, the guys that are managing the teams, they're taking their job pretty freaking serious. These guys really want to know that the support staff that are looking after their athletes are doing the right thing. Mistakes happen, but they want to hear the plan. I would argue to you that I think wearable technology will help you articulate the plan and give feedback to these people who are really key principal investors in the programs you're working with. The technology is very good for providing useful feedback. It allows the owners, the general managers, and coaches to understand the plan and follow the progress or lack thereof. It allows and encourages this mechanobiological approach, which links what we're doing with rehab to state-of-the-art understanding of the biology of different tissue. It facilitates quicker understanding of individual responses so you can tune the input based on the outputs. It helps implement criterion-based progressions so you know when they're ready for the next thing. It helps you clarify the demands of competition, and it gives player another reason for believing in this process that you're going through as you try to return to play. Thank you for your time.